Okay, so let me be the first to wish you good afternoon Eastern Time. It's a pleasure to have you all here for a very special seminar today by Joseph Graves, who spoke in a series several years ago with Andrea Dreyup, but today is giving a solo performance. Really, we wanted to hear the more scientific as opposed to the medical education side. So I'm really looking forward to this. And so this seminar is brought to you by the Health and the Public Interest Program, a program that stresses the non-clinical, non-medical determinants of health and emphasizes especially the social determinants of health and well-being. And so this talk really fits right in with that theme of our program. The talk is going to go for around 40 or 45 minutes after a short introduction by Giraud, one of our students, and then we'll have a Q&A session with ample time to field questions and discussion points up to perhaps as late as 1:15. So we'll take student questions first, moderated by Giraud, and then Giraud will switch over to more general questions. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion as much as the presentation itself. So with that, I will turn it over to Giraud for the introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Joseph Graves, an evolutionary biologist and genetist. He's a professor of biology science at North Carolina A&T State University and formerly served as an associate dean for research at the Joint School of Nanoscience and Nanoengineering, jointly also administered by NCAT State University and UNC Greensboro. Dr. Graves' research spanned evolutionary biology, genetics, genomics, including work on adaptation aging and biology responses to environmental stressors. He had led research funded by the NIH, NSF, and other major agencies. He is also a fellow of American Association of the Advancement of Science. And the fun fact about Dr. Graves, he's also a world-class chess player. He's ranked in the top 0.3% globally in Bliss chess. He also writes about chess, how basically chess shaped his scientific thinking in A Voice of Wilderness. Dr. Graves, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for this invitation. I'm going to share my screen now, make sure that I have the right presentation up here. Okay, yeah, so outstanding. So, why black people die sooner, what medicine gets wrong about race, and how to fix it. See if I can get this bad boy actually going. There we go. Let's put that down and let's see. Yeah, there we go. So, I began to think about why and how people thought racially in our society in the early 1990s. This led to my first publication, first book on the subject, The Emperor's New Clothes, which was published in 2001. The Emperor provides you with a history of the development of racial thinking in the Western world. A few years later, I certainly didn't finish this. The sequel, The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, came out. At that point, I thought I'd really put this baby to bed. The scientific arguments for why we didn't have biological races and why our racial groups were socially defined was so apparent, so clear. The evidence was so overwhelming that I honestly never thought I'd have to write about it again. But the world turns, the world moves on. And in 2019, things have gotten worse, not better, in terms of people's understanding of the difference between biological and social definitions of race. And so, my good colleague, Dr. Alan Goodman, who is a former president of the American Association of Anthropologists, called me up and said that we needed to put out a new book. We agreed that we should put it in question answer format. And so Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions came out in late 2021, where it was a Kyrgyz Review top nonfiction of the year. And a few years later, it won the W. Howells Award for being the best book in biological anthropology. So, here are some other recent papers that I've written as this struggle to help people understand the significance of the difference between biological and social conceptions of race, seems to never stop. And also the newest book, which just came out in October, Why Black People Die Sooner, What Medicine Gets Wrong About Race and How to Fix It. In part one, I address the question of why. So chapter one is Racial Injustice Causes Health Injustice. Chapter two, I explain the evolutionary theory of aging and the evidence for it and how it explains diseases of maintenance or lack thereof and why those cannot be racialized. Okay, chapter three, there's no slavery gene, debunking the myths of hypertension, one of these long-standing myths that, hypertension or high blood pressure is a genetically innate feature of people of African descent is debunked in this chapter. Chapter four, I deal with new misconceptions about biological and social definitions of race and microbiome research. Chapter five, infectious disease strikes unevenly. The poor die more. Again, explaining why this is true and then why it's not genetic. Chapter six, bad blood, is a discussion of the history of the racialization of sickle cell anemia and the issues related to modern treatments which are being developed by tools such as CRISPR. Chapter 7, Cancer is Unfair. Again, explaining why everybody gets cancer based upon Chapter 2. And then again, how it ends up being differentially prevalent in different populations, again, based upon social determinants and not genetics. Chapter 8, Race and Epigenomics. Nobody knows the trouble we've seen. So this brings us to modern discoveries of epigenomic impacts on the expression of genes and how this plays into various disease conditions and how new pharmacogenomic approaches can help us actually deal with these diseases in an efficacious way. And again, why this is not racialized. Chapter 9, how algorithms can hurt. So once again, looking at the various algorithms used in medical clinical practice, why they're flawed, why they need to be fixed, and how we can fix them. Finally, chapter 10, I talk about the promises and the peril of precision medicine, how it may be able to play a role in addressing these longstanding health disparities, but presently is not. And then chapter 11, doing the work to change medical minds, in which I detail the work that Dr. Andrea Dayrup, myself, and others have been doing over the last 3 years to engage medical practitioners, clinicians, about why their racial misconceptions are harming patients, and again, how we can fix it. And finally, in the conclusion, building a world where we can all live well. And the last section of the conclusion is entitled The Inmates Are in Charge of the Asylum, in which I discuss the lunacy which is being propagated by the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Health and Human Services Agency now. So I also want to bring your attention to a new book that's going to be coming out in June of 2026, which I worked very closely with the editors Zeshan Qureshi and Marinisha Suleiman, entitled Anti-Racist Medicine. This focuses mainly on the situation in the UK and the European Union. It'll be published by Elsevier and marketed to those countries, not so much in the United States, but still, this is going to be a major step forward for medical practice in the UK and in Europe. So anyway, let's talk about why medicine has always gotten race wrong. But what the smallpox spared, the flux swept off. After all our pains and care to give them their messes in due order and season, keeping their lodgings as clean and sweet as possible, and enduring so much misery and stench so long among a parcel of creatures nastier than swine, and after all our expectations to be defeated by their mortality. This is from the Journal of Captain Thomas Phillips, complaining about the high mortality rate on his slave ship, the Hannibal, in 1693. Now, the Hannibal had been packed with human beings way beyond the capacity that slavers usually attempted to bring across the Atlantic in any sort of living or marketable condition. And so the results of Philip's ill fated journey were entirely predictable by the number of human beings that were packed into the slave holes. He should not have been surprised that so many people died. Now, why has medicine always gotten race wrong? Well, first and foremost, um, most scholars still continue to get race wrong. And the reason they continue to get it wrong is because they routinely conflate two very different race concepts with two very different intellectual histories. And that is the biological race concept and socially constructed, socially defined race concepts. Now, the two have interacted with each other across the centuries. And so don't get me wrong here, but they are very different ways of viewing human variation. So the biological race concept begins in the Western world, organized around what individuals and organisms look like. So this is what we call in biology morphology, and in modern genetics, we would call the phenotype. And so this dominated the way naturalists thought between the 16th and 18th centuries. But what most people don't understand is that this was entirely dependent upon Christian special creationist belief. There was no evolutionary organization of biology in this time period. So these folks were motivated by the philosophy. I'm really beginning to forget the name of it right now. Of Yeah, there's a title for this, and I'm just drawing a blank. But to put things succinctly, it was the notion that we could understand the beneficence of God's creation by looking at the organisms and how they fit into their environments. Now, of course, this was flawed because there were things that organisms didn't do very well. And certainly disease is one of the things that this view and this was called, by the way, natural theology, couldn't accommodate. Now, in the early 19th century, still under agencies of special creationism, was the idea that organisms had been created for specific geographical locations across the globe. Now, this was put forward by the leading biologist of the time, Louis Agassiz, and who came up with the idea of zones of creation, in which each zone of creation had its own plants, had its own animals, and its own variety of human. And for Agassiz, it was biologically mistaken to take human beings out of their zones of creation. So for Agassiz, he not only was averse to people of African descent, he based his aversion to them in the Western Hemisphere and in North America to the idea that they really shouldn't have been there, and that in fact it was doing a disservice to them as well as their slaveholders. Now, we don't actually get a scientific understanding of human biological variation until the 20th century. And this occurs after the neo Darwinian synthesis, which occurs in the early portion of the 20th century and unifies natural selection theory with Mendelian genetics. And now you finally have a way of understanding variation in any organism, including humans, that actually can be tested and demonstrated whether these ideas are correct or not. So we get population-based identification of races based upon things like the frequency of genes beginning in the late 1930s, 1940s. Now, in the latter portion of the 20th century, in the 1970s, 1980s, we also get the cladistic race hypothesis, in which races are identified as unique evolutionary lineages. And this can be determined by the use of phylogenetic methods. Now, what should be clear to you is that the biological race concept could be applied to any species, and in fact, was applied to all species in an attempt to understand the variation that they manifested within those species. It was no way unique to human beings. Now, on the other hand, the socially constructed or socially defined race concept, which arbitrarily utilized aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, or any other trait that was suitable, only existed in humans, and it always existed in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. In other words, it was a means to determine whether an individual should be allowed to take place or take part fully in the social life of that nation, or whether they were going to be a second class citizen. Now, from this, you should recognize, based upon what we now know about human genetic variation, that our species, anatomically modern humans, does not contain biological races. So this is based upon the population-based criteria and the cladistic race-based criteria, which Alan and I did a really good job of explaining in our 2022 book, Racism, Not Race. Now, that's not something I'm going to explain in this lecture. So if you need more background on that, I strongly recommend you look at the 2022 book. Now, I also want to point out that we explain that the non-existence of biological races is very different from whether geographically based genetic variation exists, which it certainly does in our species. And so people often, again, confuse the statement that we don't have biological races with the idea, well, that has to be wrong because we can clearly tell a person from Norway versus a person from the Congo. Yeah, that's true. If you look at those phenotypic traits, you can definitely tell whether somebody came from Norway or whether somebody came from the Congo. That doesn't mean that Norwegians and Congolese are different biological races. It means that they differ in various aspects of their phenotypic traits, which are encoded by different portions of their genome. That is not the definition of race. Okay, so now going back into the 18th century, European naturalists began to muse about the racial traits of the Negro, okay, the Africans that they were coming in contact with relative to the traits of Europeans. Now, for example, Francois Bernier in France, looking at the traits of Negroes and Europeans or Caucasians, found that there was no superiority of Caucasians to Negroes or Europeans to Africans. Okay. He was unclear about whether these traits were inherited or whether they were due to the environment. But what he was clear about was that all human beings were members of the same species. Now, the others on this list, people like von Leibniz, Blumenbach, also found no objective ranking of human beings. Okay, whereas Leibniz thought it was all environmental, Blumenbach correctly understood that these differences were both heritable and genetic and both due to environment. And they also understood that there was no different species. Camper, Buffon, and Miners found Africans inferior. And notably, they thought that this inferiority was genetically encoded and that the environment had nothing to do with it. But they also recognized that humans belong to the same species. Okay, now, if we go forward, we begin to see how these conceptions began to impact medical treatment. For example, Benjamin Rush, a founding father, considered blackness a form of leprosy. that could be cured by medicine. So in Rush's case, he sees blackness as a result of some environmental factor. 1799, William Harvey and John Lindsay described the disease Cachexia africana, or dirt eating, observed in enslaved Africans suffering from emotional distress or depression. Now, it turns out that dirt eating is a commonly used, or was a commonly used practice in the tropics to deal with iron deficiency. And so, for folks whose diets were and certainly not very good in their enslaved condition, this may have been the result of their feeling iron distress and knowing that eating soil could help that. Now, on the other hand, Samuel Cartwright was an internationally recognized physician who was considered an expert on pneumonia, croup, fever, and cholera. He received an award from Harvard University for his work on veins and absorption, as well as a medal from the Boston Medical Society for his essay on resuscitating drowning victims. Now, despite these impressive accomplishments, Cartwright was perfectly comfortable using faulty racist logic in his attempt to scientifically prove the inferiority of the Negro. In his 1851 report on the diseases and physical peculiarities of the Negro race, addressed to the Medical Association of Louisiana, he defined and documented African diseases, such as the infamous drapetomania, an insane desire to run away, rascality, unruliness, and dysthesia Ethiopia, performing tasks in a haphazard manner. Now, we have not advanced greatly from Samuel Cartwright. In the 21st century, this essay, I Am a Racially Profiling Doctor, appeared in the New York Times. Sally Seitel, who said, in practicing medicine, I am not colorblind. I always take note of my patient's race. So do many of my colleagues. We do it because certain diseases and treatment responses cluster by ethnicity. Now, that was over 20 years ago. Okay. In an essay last year, Seitel and Hutto claimed that medical school had gotten too political. They said that activist MDs had forgotten their duty to treat patients. They particularly resisted efforts such as that of the American medical colleges, calling for the nation's 155 medical schools to employ anti-racist and unconscious bias training and engaging in interracial dialogues. They opposed the American Medical Association's strategic plan to embed racial justice and advance health equity that encouraged physicians to dismantle white patriarchy and other systems of oppression in medical practice. They were particularly concerned about, quote, doctrinaire pseudoscientific assertions about the sources of racial health disparities. Read that as they were opposed to the idea that most of these health disparities are produced by social determinants of health rather than genetic differences between the so-called racial groups which they believe in. Now, these misconceptions still exist widely amongst medical practitioners. Now, this is a paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, USA in 2016, based upon surveys done at the University of Virginia's medical school. Now, if you know anything about the University of Virginia's medical school, you'll know it's a premier medical school. So this existence of these misconceptions at a premier medical school is really reason to give folks pause. Now, over the last 3 years with Andrea, we've done over close to 100 of these lectures at leading medical schools in the United States, Canada, and the UK. And we found the exact same sets of misconceptions amongst these physicians that we talk to. So ideas like blacks age more slowly than whites. Okay. In first year medical students, 33.3% accepted that as true. 38.9% thought that was true in the second year. 50% of their residents thought it was true. Black nerve endings less sensitive than white. 12.7 in first years, 19.4 in second years. And luckily, by the third year, they had extinguished that false belief. But still, 14.3% of their residents thought that that was true. and these others. Now, all of these things are scientifically false. But what's even more shocking is when I reviewed this paper, I found things that the physicians who wrote it, who were attempting to do the right thing, thought were true, were actually false. So this problem still exists in that medical practitioners, biomedical researchers still do not understand the difference between biological and social conceptions of race and still suffer under these racist misconceptions about biological variation in human beings. So, um, as I pointed out, last few years I've been deeply engaged with this with Professor Dayrup from Duke University. I was part of the group that did the revision to the 10th edition of Robbins and Kumar's Basic Pathology, which is the most widely used pathology textbook in the world. And we were able to do a good job of getting out most of the racial medicine in that book, but we didn't get it all. And that's because we were constantly fighting with the other editors to be able to rewrite sections where the material was just wrong. Um, but we were able to get in a section on health disparities based upon social determinants of health, which was a major victory. We also were able to get in inclusive images of diseases that occur or manifest in the skin, which was also a great victory. Prior to this 11th edition, most of these images were shown in only people of fair complexion, and that was generally the case across the world. Now, my fear, of course, is that when there's a 12th edition, that most of these changes that we put in to the 11th edition will be lost because Andrea resigned from the editorial group of this book, simply not wanting to have to go through fighting with them again. And I'm sure in the 12th edition, those people won't call me back to be able to address their racial misconceptions. Now, let me quickly go back and talk about this paper that we published in Academic Medicine. Now, Race in the Reading, a study of problematic uses of race and ethnicity in a prominent pediatrics textbook. We found over 200 racial misconceptions in the primary book of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And we outlined them in this paper. We talked about the sources of these misconceptions. For example, using race as a surrogate for social variables, conflating terminology, overgeneralizing or making claims on limited data, lacking clinical relevance, which was really important. Oftentimes, with extremely rare diseases, they would say, well, this particular rare disease has a prevalence of 6 per 100,000 in blacks, but only 2 per 100,000 in whites. Well, yeah. So there's a difference in frequency, but at that frequency, that has no clinical relevance. You're not going to diagnose someone with this disease knowing, oh, well, it's 6 times more prevalent in black people than it is in white people. Lacking inclusivity, using, again, generalization from only 1 or 2 groups instead of the panorama of humans that live on this planet. Things that promoted racial stereotypes. And finally, contradicting claims. In one portion of the book, they would say, oh, this is found mainly in blacks. And another one, it would say, oh, this is found mainly in whites. And it would be the same disease. Now, as a result of our paper, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a statement in May of 2022, some 3 months after we published this paper, okay, rebuking racial medicine. But of course, what's really interesting is that when this statement was made, public statement was made, they didn't mention our paper at all. We weren't cited at all, even though I'm absolutely sure that their decision to come out with a statement against racial medicine was based upon their reaction to our paper. Now, so quickly, going to talk to you about what we do know about how natural selection has altered the human species. And what you'll be surprised at, first off, is if we take any 2 people chosen at random in the globe, they share between 99.5 and 99.9% of their genome in common, which means that a very small amount of adaptation has occurred in human beings. In fact, most of the genetic variation we see in human beings is a result of random genetic drift, not natural selection. But the things that we know were definitely produced by natural selection are things like lactase persistence, which we find in populations of domesticated cattle in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe. Things like Arctic environment adaptation in the Arctic, things like skin pigmentation, which varies from the tropics to the Arctic, altitude adaptation, which occurs in the high altitude populations in East Africa, in the Himalayas, and in the Andes Plateau. So, and of course, adaptation to diseases like trypanosomiasis and malaria. Now, when you look at the number of genes that for which we have this evidence of very strong adaptation, it's a pitifully small number. If you count the number of symbols on this slide, it's about 35 to 40. But we have between 19,000 to 20,000 protein coding genes in the human genome, of which only really 35 or 40 of which show really strong evidence of natural selection occurring since folks left Africa some 100,000 years ago. And what this again is underscores how similar human beings are to each other. Now, so point I'm trying to make again, humans do not have biological races, but we do have socially defined races which show defined disparities in health and disease. Now, to understand that, we have to utilize the tools of quantitative genetics, not Mendelian genetics, which I showed on the last slide. And here we understand that the variation in any physical trait or phenotype is produced by the variance due to genes, plus the variance due to environment, plus the variance due to gene by environment effect, plus the covariance of genes and environment, plus error based upon how you define the phenotype. Now, if you look at this in the case of most complex diseases, such as heart disease and cancer, which I've shown below, you see a large effect by socially defined race. But that large effect is produced mainly by a small effect resulting from genetic difference, but then a large effect due to environmental difference, a large effect due to gene by environment interaction, and a large effect due to the covariance of genes and environment. In other words, the covariance results from the fact that certain people are more likely to be found in toxic environments than others. Now, we don't know about error. In some cases, error has no impact. Like most people do a pretty good job of measuring a patient's blood pressure when they're in the clinic. So the error there is going to be small. But some diseases, like behavioral diseases such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, there's a huge error effect in the way that physicians are biased in diagnosing Black patients with schizophrenia with the same symptoms that they would diagnose a white patient with bipolar disorder. Now, you'd say, well, maybe this isn't really that big a deal, but the treatment regimens and the prognosis for being able to live a relatively normal life are dramatically different if you are diagnosed as a schizophrenic versus being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So that error does matter. Now, so let's talk about why this genetic difference isn't that significant with regard to complex disease. So first and foremost, we have the tools now due to whole genome sequencing to sequence people. And so in an early study of this in 2008, this Lohmiller et al. Study looked at genes which were possibly bad, okay, versus those that were probably bad. So when you looked at the difference between African Americans and European Americans for genes that were possibly bad, there was no statistically significant difference. But when you looked at the for genes that were probably bad, it was actually European Americans that displayed more genes that were probably bad, statistically significantly so, than African Americans. Now, this was a small study, Only a couple of hundred genomes were involved, because I think it was actually less than 100 genomes were involved in the study. So you really couldn't make much of these findings, except they did go in the opposite of direction from the notion that Africans somehow are genetically inferior, and that's what explains the higher prevalence of disease in African Americans compared to European Americans. But guess what? Fast forward to 2024. Now we have the All of Us study of over 245,000 whole genomes. Now you could really make some conclusions from 245,000 whole genomes compared to under 100. And once again, when we look at likely pathogenic clinical variants, we find that people of European ancestry in the United States have a higher number of likely pathogenic clinical variants in their genome compared to African Americans and Amerindians. But when we look at, patterns of disease, once again, we see African Americans and people of Amerindian ancestry having much higher patterns of disease, complex disease, than European Americans do, which completely vitiates the idea that the difference that we see in complex disease, such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, etc., is driven by genetic differences. Because if that were so, the pattern would be the other way around. So we are beginning to get greater recognition of this fallacy. And that is shown in a report that was released from a blue ribbon commission from the National Academies of Science, Medicine, and Engineering, entitled Using Population Descriptors in Genetics and Genomics Research, a new framework for an evolving field, back in 2023. So if you haven't seen this report, it's free. You can download it by just searching the title. But what Andrea and I have found is that very few physicians have read this. So again, across these grand round lectures that we did over the last 2 years, we bring up this report, and most of the physicians had never heard of it. So that's where we have a great deal of work to do. So I was called on by that commission to testify back in April 4 of 2022. And I said to them, our social conceptions of race and ethnicity do not match the underlying biological and genetic variation within our species. And we should never confuse the things that were created for the purposes of oppressing people with the nature of that biological and genetic variation. So fast forward 2 more years, and now we have a White House that has decided to completely disregard the scientific consensus concerning biological and social conceptions of race. Here's a letter that we wrote to Science Magazine about this fallacy and why, scientists need to stand up to the idea of going back to genetic determinism, which is entirely on the agenda of the Trump administration. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and happy to take any of your questions about my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graves. Quick reminder regarding the questions. My colleague and I will actually go first regarding the questions, and then afterwards we'll probably go with everybody else. Thank you so much again for being here. I'll go ahead. Please, Dr. Grave, my question will be regarding the Mendelian genetics. It works great for single gene disorders like sickle cells, but you argue it breaks down when applied to complex diseases and racial categories. In precision medicine, how do we get the genetics right without falling back on race, and especially in this political environment?
Well, so you got two very different questions there. Okay. So there's the science. So let me talk about the science first. Okay. So, the modern methods that we use now are genome-wide association studies, and they are organized around people with the disease and people without, case control design. Now, um, you also have to recognize the things that can confound a GWAS, which, people who know what they're doing recognize. So, for example, most of the GWAS studies that we have, and I talk about this in the new book, are derived from Eurasian populations. The Eurasian populations have different patterns of linkage on their chromosomes compared to African populations. That's because sub-Saharan African populations have existed longer. And as a result of that, there have been more crossover events which occur during meiosis every time gametes are formed. So linkage blocks are much smaller. Okay. Eurasians are newer populations, so their linkage blocks are bigger. And in fact, as you move away from Africa, linkage disequilibrium blocks get bigger and bigger and bigger until you get into the Western Hemisphere. And indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere have the biggest linkage blocks. So you can account for that mathematically. And so, again, folks who know enough do account for that. And therefore, we can then determine, what genetic variants are associated with complex disease in given populations. In some cases, the variants are unified. In other words, we find it in Africans, we find it in Europeans, we find it in East Asians, we find it in indigenous people in the Americas. In some cases, due to these linkage differences, the variants are different. So we find in some cases variants that are contributing to complex disease in Africans that don't contribute to it in Europeans. And that's where precision medicine and pharmacogenomics can take us, is looking at these complexities of population structure and then determining what genetic determinants are involved. And then you can develop treatments that address those specific pathways. Now, you will remember that in my presentation, I spoke about the fact that most of the determinants of complex disease are not genetic. Most of this is environmental. So we could do a great deal to reduce the prevalence of these complex diseases, such as cancer and heart disease, by non-medical interventions. So these are, public health, social interventions. For example, when people ask me, I did a thing for the New England Journal of Medicine. I said, Professor Graves, if you wanted to deal with health disparities, what's the one thing that you could do to reduce them? And my answer was universal health care. That doesn't require a great deal of new science. It doesn't require, building new data centers so that you can have more powerful AI engines to look at genomic data. It really doesn't. It requires that the society make the decision that the lives of all people are worthwhile, and we're going to protect those lives by making sure they have access to quality health care. It requires that, you give people a decent income so that they have jobs. It requires that you give them access to decent nutrition so that they have, healthy, nutritious food in their neighborhood. None of that requires sophisticated genomic research. So if I wanted to, reduce, and what I've been saying for now decades, if you want to reduce these health disparities, give people decent housing, give people access to transportation, give them a decent living, give them appropriate health care, make sure that they eat good food from the time they're babies to the time they're adults. This isn't rocket science. So then it comes down to your second question, Gerard, which was in this political environment. Well, quite frankly, in this political environment, they're trying to kill people. RFK's policies on vaccination will kill people. Kids will die from diseases that used to be controlled. Old people like me will die from coming in contact with kids with diseases that used to be controlled. So the answer to that is we need to change this political environment. Because if we do not, people are going to die that didn't have to die. So that's, again, on you, the citizens of this country. What will you stand for? What kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to have a country that everybody in the world hates because your president says, "Oh yeah, I'm just going to take Greenland today"? So that's the answer to your second question. We can do the science, okay, but the science actually tells us that we would have more effect by giving people good food, good places to live, a decent job, reducing their stress, right? Giving them, yeah. So, what's your next question?
Thank you so much, Dr. Grave. Amazing response. June, I think you're next.
Hi, Dr. Graves. Thank you so much for this incredible talk. It was very enlightening. I was wondering, I kind of have two questions in one. What do you think needs to be incorporated into medical education, do you think, to really drive home this kind of almost like myth busting of the like biological concept of race? And then also, like obviously having that in medical education is important, but what kind of further educational policy do you think needs to be implemented to reach physicians who have kind of already been practicing for a very long time and aren't reaching out to these educational resources as much?
All right. So, in terms of what can be placed in the med school curriculum, a good course in biological anthropology. That's really sort of simple. And pretty much every major medical center in the country is at a major research university and has outstanding departments of biological anthropology. So they could just add to the curriculum a good course in biological anthropology. Now, of course, the pushback from physicians is, well, the students have to learn so much. They have to learn so much, and we just can't add an additional thing, which is sort of nonsense because this is a thing that's really important and it's harming patients. So you need to find some place in your curriculum for you to put in a course in biological anthropology. At my colleague Andrea at Duke does this in the context of her pathology course, and she deals with social determinants of health in her course. And Duke's a premier medical school, so clearly this is not something that's outrageously difficult to do. I know folks at the Mayo Clinic are moving in that direction as well when we spoke to them earlier, or well, later last year. So this is not a difficult thing to do. Now, with regard to folks that are already practicing medicine, one thing you can do is approach the licensing boards with regard to the exams they use. And again, you can put in material in those exams that require that they understand the actual modern science of human biological diversity. Now, we were working on a project with Blue Cross Blue Shield on this very thing, but when who stepped into the White House and when who became Director of Health and Human Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield dropped the entire project. So again, this comes down to what do we want physicians to know, and we as the American people, what are we willing to, push for them knowing?
Thank you
And
so
I will
much,
also
Dr.
say
Grave.
quickly that the anti-racist medicine book in the UK is going to have a major impact when it comes out, because that's a model of how you should do this properly. And hopefully physicians in Canada and the European Union will learn from this. I think American physicians will be more refractory.
Thank you, Dr. Grave. We're gonna move on with another question from my colleague, Haba.
Hi, thank you so much for your for speaking today. My question was actually just about what you just said at the end of the answer to June's question, but I wanted to know if you thought there were any countries that could be role models in prioritizing research and change in this field, and if so, what do you think they do that we could try to implement? So I know you just spoke about the UK,
Okay, so
but
guys,
yeah.
I need to address a question from my son real quick, and I'm going to be right back. Dad's work never ends. So what was your question again?
Yeah, so I know you just spoke about this like towards the end of the previous question, but my question was about if you thought there were any countries that could be models in prioritizing research on this field. And if so, what do you think that they do that we could try to implement? And like I know you just spoke about the
I
UK.
literally just said that. So
Yeah.
the anti-racist medicine textbook in the UK is going to have major impacts. So again, it's a question of what will the, British medical associations do. So I'm going to give you an example of what could happen. So my book, anti-racist, I'm not anti-racist medicine, but why black people die sooner, has been reviewed in Science. Science is the premier science publication in the Western world. Okay. And it's gotten a very solid review in Science. And earlier, 2 days ago, in their newsletter to the association, they lifted the book up again as something that everybody should be reading. As far as I know, this book has received no attention from any of the major American medical journals. So not JAMA, not New England Journal of Medicine, not Academic Medicine, none of them. And I think that's because it calls them out on their long-standing history of being aligned with structural racism in the United States. So they don't want to pay attention to it. So that's what we shouldn't be doing. Okay. So let's hope that the British medical associations receive the Elsevier book, Anti-Racist Medicine, with more support. And in fact, I spoke to the editors at Elsevier and I said, you guys need to call up the people who reviewed the book for you and make sure that they write reviews of this book for the major British medical journals, Lancet, British Medical Association, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then let's see how they respond. And the book does a really good job of addressing the science, of addressing social determinants of health, of addressing cultural competency in the UK context. These are all things which could be implemented in the United States easily. So let's see what happens.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graves. Is anyone of my colleague has a question?
I see Mr. Jacob over there has his hand up.
I think we're gonna move on with Mr. Jacob. You have the floor, sir.
Awesome. Thank you for giving this talk, Dr. Graves. It's very interesting, and I really appreciate the insights. I'm gonna say, just like off the bat, I'm slightly biased here because I am friends with Sally Satel. So I'm very curious. Could you like just elaborate your criticism on her comments? It
Well,
seems to me that she was just outlining that various types of diseases are correlated with race, and it would be just better medicine to be as accurate as possible. Like if someone's race communicates that they have a higher likelihood of having a disease, such as like being black increases the likelihood of kidney disease by like threefold, it might be important information to utilize when you're treating someone. So are you saying that she should ignore that
no,
evidence
I'm saying
or
that she's absolutely wrong in that claim.
oh yeah, so it seems like her claim to me seems completely correct. So what? Can you just
No, no, no,
outline
no, no.
why that's
You
wrong?
again, you're wrong. She's wrong in the claim that specific diseases are determined or associated with socially defined race. So yeah, there are differences in prevalences in socially defined races. But for example, okay, that kidney disease issue you're talking about, okay, is found at higher frequency in people of Western African descent, but not of Eastern African descent. Now, since in the United States, we have a lot of folks who are now here from different portions of Africa. If you use the idea that black people are more likely to have kidney disease than white folks, well, some black people are and some are not. So, one of the things we do, and I did in both of the books that I just described to you, which you need to look at, and Sally should too, okay, is I explain the fallacy of attempting to conflate socially defined race with human genetic variation. They are not the same thing. And that's the thing that most physicians do not understand. So they use these social definitions of black, and then they lump people who are actually from 6 or 7 different genetic ancestry groups. So you understand there's more genetic variability on the continent of Africa than there is in the entire rest of the human species. So there's no such thing as a quote black person genetically. That's a social definition. So that's where she's wrong. Okay. And then, of course, the assault on attempting to address structural racism within medicine. So you only say that if you think there is no structural racism in medicine. And that's a ludicrous position. Okay. American medicine has been racist from the very beginning, as I point out in this new book, and as other historians of medicine have pointed out over and over again. So there is structural racism in medicine. It does impact patient outcomes, and it needs to be eliminated. For you to write an essay saying that people are, quote, too political because they're addressing structural racism, come on. You only believe that if you think that racism isn't real. And I'm sorry, the data indicate that racism is real. It's not wokeness, it's not political correctness. It's based upon the actual historical and sociological conditions of this country. And I challenge anyone to claim otherwise. In fact, tell your friend if she really believes these positions, I'm easy to find. I'm happy to go on national television with her to discuss these very issues in front of any news media she'd like.
I'll tell her that.
Yeah, tell her
But
that.
thank you for that response, Dr. Graves. It was very thorough, and I hope I get to talk to you in person sometime about these things.
All right.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jacob. We're going to proceed with the next question in the chat. Mr. Turner Coggins, would you be free to tell us more about your question, or should I say it?
Either way is fine. Thank you, Dr. Graves, for your presentation. And I'm from Bertie County, North Carolina,
All right.
which is probably, and my cousin, Oliver, they're Oliver Thomas, they're at A&T, likewise. And so the question that I had, Bertie is undoubtedly and has been probably the blackest county in the state of North Carolina. And it's been that way for some time. And the disparities that you see there are multifaceted. Where do you start in addressing, if you're looking at along the lines of the title, Why Black People Die Sooner, it's per capita, Bertie's the blackest, is probably a 2.3 year less compared to the national average life expectancy. Where do you start in addressing the needs of a county like this and other counties that you find in Eastern North Carolina as well?
Again, it comes down to, for the most part, economic development. You know, what industries exist there? How are people employed? Okay, what is their average income level? Okay, do they have access to fresh, healthy foods? Do they have access to proper housing? Okay, what pollutants are they exposed to? For example, we know that African Americans are far more likely to be exposed to 2.5 nanometer air pollutants, or actually millimeter air pollutants, than European Americans are. So, you have to look at the totality, since most of these, causes of these disparities are social. So we need to know what are the things that are operating in that county and what things can be changed, what needs to be changed. So when you say, where do you start? Again, it comes down to these really sort of basic, I hate to say it, bread and butter issues.
Yeah, and when you're looking at employment and you're looking at housing, you're right. The employer is going to be Purdue Chicken.
And there you go, right there, right? Working in those industrialized farming communities and in contact with the pathogens that are generated in industrialized farming, not a good thing.
But it's there or unemployment.
Yeah,
So,
and that's again, as I said, when you look at, again, when you look at patterns of employment, and then you look at longevity, right? Who lives longer? People who are not exposed to pathogens, people not exposed to toxins, right? And that was actually those studies in public health go back to the 19th century in England, where precisely that's exactly what they did. They looked at people based upon their employment and found that people who had, relatively cushy, non-stressful jobs lived much longer than people who had industrial jobs breathing in, factory soot every day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Turner, for your question. Much appreciated.
So,
So I have a question, but I can't figure out how to, here it is. Okay, there's my hand. So, yeah, Joe, thanks so much for your talk today in the Q&A session, which I'm not putting an end to. I'm just saying it because it's my opportunity to say that. Um, but, I think that Turner Coggins raises a great point, which is in the reality of the day, it's a tough question to answer, right? Like, where do we start when the whole system is broken and you have a majority black poor population and people who are taking advantage of that and workers who are suffering the environmental results of that, et cetera. And of course, the answer is to fix the latter issues, not to worry about who's black and who's not black. It kind of reminds me of when at Georgetown, when this discussion first started taking place about how to anti-racism in medicine and how to enter things in patient charts, and the focus was just on you don't start a chart by saying a 56-year-old African American man, da 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 da, right? That what you're doing is you're talking about race first. And if you question somebody by saying, well, what about the inevitable truth that being black does cause you to have a different chance of or different prevalence of disease in your family or your population, then the immediate answer was you can't do it, it's racist, etc. When the real answer to that is, what you really need to be doing is looking at the social determinants and talking about that first, right? Talk about the person first and what kind of condition they're living in, etc. And I think the some of the issues that came up with one of the earlier questions revolves around that too, that it's hard for some people to get beyond the fact that, well, yeah, if you're black, you're going to have a bigger chance of this or that. Well, no, because what does being black even mean, right? One drop of blood, um, 1/16th, one parent, right? I've just been listening to Rachel Maddow's podcast on in the Japanese during World War II being put into camps, and there's a discussion in there about one drop of blood of Japanese blood would make you Japanese, and therefore a terrorist, a potential terrorist, and we got to get away from that kind of association of genetics and race, et cetera, with some kind of presumed traits that are, really a result of social things. So I don't know. I'm just ranting, but thanks so much for your talk
and
today.
that's also why I presented the quantitative genetic equation, right? Which says that,
Mhm.
these physical traits, predisposition to disease are produced by genetic effects, environmental effects, the interaction of genes and environments, the covariance of genes and environments. So you can't understand any physical trait by just looking at the genetics. In fact, what we know about disease is that only 15% of human diseases have a strong genetic determinant.
Right.
40% of them have a genetic determinant, but 60% have no genetic determinant. So
Okay. So
that's how we do genetics properly. is and not, genetic determinism where if you see a particular genetic variant, you assume X, Y, and Z about the individual.
Okay, so let me ask another quick question. That wasn't a question that I asked before. So tell me about the link between chess and you getting into all of this. I play a little chess. I'm not at the level that you're talking about, but I'm just curious about that. I read the Rizzo's book where he talks about the relationship of chess to what the Wu-Tang Clan does, and different people use chess to different ends. So I'm interested in your take on that.
Well, you got to understand where I grew up and, who my parents were. My parents grew up in Jim Crow American South, had very little to no education. And so they couldn't help me with my homework. And when I started playing chess, it changed the social network of people that I was relating to, right? The smartest people in my school were members of the chess team. And so I began hanging out with people who were on their way to MIT, Harvard, and Yale instead of people who were on their way, to the assembly line. And so
Mhm.
for me, the game, changed my social trajectory, but also taught me how to think deeply about problems and also increased the speed at which I calculate and think about problems. So I give you an example. So between 2019 and 2022, I wrote 3 books, one graduate textbook in nanomaterials, and then 2 trade books. And I am literally the only scientist in history to have 2 of their books reviewed by science in the same calendar year. It never happened before. And that's because of the way my mind works. I just do things much more quickly than other people. Next year, I have 3 books coming out. Now, these are not all books I wrote by myself, but 3 books in one year is pretty incredible. So yeah, just did that for me.
So good advice for young people out there. Thank you.
I just see a new question, probably the last one in the chat by Miss Lisa Villeneuve. What is the best way to discuss very rare blood types respectfully that may be more patient among persons with certain ethnic heritage background in order to encourage donations? For example, using the term ethnic heritage is found in many campaigns. Thank you so much for your insight and
So
expertise,
I
Dr.
work
Graves.
with the Be the Match Foundation, which is in Minneapolis. And you have to know again something about population variation in these genetic markers associated with histocompatibility. And one of the things that again should be clear to folks is that if it's a common marker, then you can find donors in any population. But if it's rare, and which population is going to have the most rare genetic markers? Turns out it's Africans. Now, why do Africans have the most rare genetic markers? Because the mutation rate in human genes is essentially the same in all human populations. And since Africans have been around longer, they've accumulated more mutations. And so, therefore, Africans are going to have more rare blood types than Europeans, than East Asians, than indigenous Americans who went through a big bottleneck coming into the Americas. So, where do you go to find matches? Well, one of the places they go is Brazil. Okay, now why Brazil? Because the largest number of enslaved people from Africa went to Brazil, not North America. So there's far more diversity in Afro-Brazilians for blood types than there are in African Americans, who actually, are a very small fraction of the number of enslaved people that came to the Western Hemisphere, only about 500,000. So other than America, I would go to the Caribbean. But another thing for African Americans is because of their admixture with Europeans, which varies depending upon which portion of the nation you're in, as you just pointed out. Okay. Knowing who used to be your slave master is a good way to find matches as well. And in fact, there have been several cases where a donor match was found in the family of the person that formerly enslaved that African American family, because these markers are inherited, in your pedigree. So that's how you deal with that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Griff, for this amazing presentation and seminar. Dr. Adams, the floor is yours.
Well, Giro, thank you so much for a good session of moderating and your preparation that went into this. Dr. Graves, I know that you and Giro went back and forth, and you worked closely with him, and I appreciate that. And your enthusiasm in doing this for our group is unparalleled. So thank you, and hope that our paths cross again one day. And I'm going to read your book as soon as I can rip it out of the hands of my wife, who opened the package when it first arrived and has been telling me what's in your latest book. But I did listen to the interview. And those of you students, if you didn't do your assignment and listen to that 20-minute interview before class today, I urge you to do your assignments next time around, but also go back and listen to this one because it's quite inspiring. So thank you, Joseph, and we'll catch you down the road sometime.
All right. Well, thank you very much.